the image of Bonnie and Clyde remains fixed in the mind of the world. We see a beautiful young couple driving fast cars, wearing fine clothes, and living by their own laws under the wide open skies of the American West. But buried beneath the romance are facts that rarely make it onto the screen. The truth behind Bonnie and Clyde is filled with poverty, fear, violence, betrayal, and suffering. Tonight, we are counting down 21 facts Hollywood pushed into the shadows. Stay with me until the very end because the number one truth reveals what really happened during the final seconds of Bonnie and Clyde's lives. It was so horrifying that even the Undertaker struggled to deal with what he saw. Number 20, a secret ring. Hollywood portrayed Bonnie and Clyde as inseparable soulmates who belonged only to each other. In reality, Bonnie never divorced her first husband, Roy Thornton. When she died in 1934, she was still wearing his wedding ring. She had married Thornton when she was only 16 years old, looking for an escape from her difficult life. The marriage was a disaster from the very beginning. Thornton was a violent man who frequently disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving her alone and penniless. Eventually, Thornton was arrested and sentenced to a long term in prison for robbery. Although they never lived together again, the legal bond between them remained completely intact. Bonnie never took the steps to end the marriage officially. When she met Clyde Barrow, she carried the heavy weight of her past with her. The romantic myth suggests that her bond with Clyde wiped away everything that came before. But her own fingers told a different story. Throughout her entire run with the Barrow gang as she fled from state to state and dodged bullets from law enforcement, she kept that silver band on her finger. It was a strange, silent reminder of a life she could not fully leave behind. Clyde knew about the marriage, and the situation caused regular tension within the group. The legendary romance was legally a sham. The woman who was running across the country with America's public enemy number one was still, in the eyes of the law, the wife of a common prison inmate. Even in death, she could not escape her past. The wedding ring remained on her finger as she lay in the muddy ditch where her journey ended. Number 19, rejected by mafia. They never operated in Chicago's underworld or New York's mafia circles. Most of their crimes took place on rural roads in tiny towns and struggling businesses across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Louisiana. The public often groups them with figures like John Dillinger or Al Capone, imagining them walking into grand city banks with submachine guns. The reality was much smaller and far less glamorous. They were creatures of the backwoods and the dirt tracks. The large crime syndicates of the era wanted nothing to do with Bonnie and Clyde. The big city bosses viewed the duo as chaotic, disorganized, and dangerous to business. The Barrow gang did not have a network of safe houses in Chicago or corrupt politicians protecting them in New York. They operated in the spaces between towns, utilizing their knowledge of country roads to cross state lines before local sheriffs could organize a pursuit. Their days were spent driving through endless miles of farmland, looking for isolated targets. They targeted places where the police force consisted of a single deputy who lacked the weapons to fight back. This reliance on the countryside kept them moving constantly. They could never settle into a comfortable urban hideout. They were trapped in a loop of rural robberies, moving from one tiny dusty town to the next, always one step ahead of a local posse. The wide open spaces of the American West became their prison, forcing them to remain in the shadows of the wilderness. Number 18, media fabricated legends. Depression-era newspapers discovered that a young outlaw couple sold more papers than politicians. Editors emphasized romance and adventure, while victim stories rarely made the front page. The media during the 1930s required sensational stories to distract a suffering public from the horrors of the economic collapse. A handsome young man and a stylish young woman running from the law provided the perfect narrative for publishers looking to increase circulation. Reporters invented dialogue, exaggerated the scale of their robberies, and created a thrilling drama out of sordid crimes. The public devoured these stories, turning the fugitives into folk heroes who seemed to defy the very system that was failing ordinary citizens. The actual violence of their actions was minimized or hidden beneath headlines that focused on their narrow escapes and clever tricks. The real people who suffered at their hands were treated as minor characters in a grand national theater piece. This media campaign created an image that the real couple could never actually live up to. The public fell in love with a pair of fictional characters who happened to share the names of two desperate criminals. Bonnie and Clyde read these newspapers while hiding in the woods, seeing themselves transformed into legends by writers who had never met them. The power of the printing press turned a series of messy store robberies into a historic crusade, setting a trap of fame that made their eventual capture an absolute necessity for the government. Before we continue, I'm curious about something. Do you think Bonnie and Clyde became famous because of what they did or because newspapers turned them into celebrities? Let me know your opinion in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. Number 17, that staged photo. The most famous image of Bonnie Parker shows her with a cigar clenched between her teeth, leaning against a car with a pistol in her hand. This single photograph defined her image for generations as a tough, gun-toting bandit queen. The cigar was simply a prop during a private photo session. Bonnie didn't smoke cigars at all. She was a regular smoker of conventional cigarettes, but the image of her with a large cigar was far too shocking for the media to ignore. The photograph was taken during a rare moment of relaxation when the gang was hiding out in Joplin, Missouri. They were playing around with their cameras and posing in exaggerated theatrical ways to amuse themselves. It was an inside joke, a moment of play acting by young people who were trying to look much tougher than they felt. They never intended for these pictures to leave their private collection. When the police later discovered the undeveloped film during a sudden raid, the image was thrust into the public eye. Newspapers printed the picture on front pages across the nation, presenting it as absolute proof of her hardened criminal nature. The image shocked the conservative public of the 1930s, who found the sight of a woman smoking a cigar to be deeply scandalous. The false impression became an undeniable truth in the public mind, permanently erasing the image of the quiet honor student and replacing her with a cigar-smoking monster. Number 16, fatal Joplin mistakes. The photographs that turned Bonnie and Clyde into celebrities were taken by Clyde himself and other members of the gang. After police discovered the film during a raid, newspapers published the images nationwide, creating an outlaw legend almost overnight. Clyde possessed a great interest in photography and carried a camera with him throughout their journeys. He liked to document their life on the run, capturing images of Bonnie, his brother Buck, and their associates standing by their fast cars. These photo sessions were a way to pass the heavy hours of boredom that filled their lives between crimes. Clyde carefully adjusted the lenses and composed the shots, capturing the group in moments of laughter and bravado. They looked like tourists on a strange vacation rather than desperate fugitives fleeing for their lives. The camera recorded their youth, their style, and their apparent lack of fear. The turning point came when they had to abandon their hideout in Joplin, leaving their personal belongings behind in their rush to escape. The police found the rolls of film sitting on a table and immediately developed them. The resulting images provided the media with a visual gold mine. Suddenly, the nameless outlaws had faces, styles, and a palpable sense of life. The images created an immediate obsession across the country, turning Clyde's private hobby into the primary fuel for their own myth. Number 15, writing to Ford. Bonnie wrote poems about their exploits, while Clyde reportedly encouraged publicity through letters, photographs, and stories sent to newspapers. They weren't just media creators, they actively fed the legend. They understood the power of the press and used it to their advantage, shaping how the world perceived their actions. Bonnie's poetry was not just a private hobby, she wrote with the explicit goal of having her words read by the public. Her poems, such as the famous story of Bonnie and Clyde, portrayed their lives as a tragic romance against an unfair world. She sent these verses to newspapers knowing that editors would print them. Clyde took pride in his reputation as a driver and an escape artist. He wanted the police and the public to know exactly who he was. He allegedly sent a letter to Henry Ford praising the speed and power of the V8 engine, stating that he only drove Ford cars when he needed to make a clean getaway. This active participation in their own publicity showed a deep desire for recognition. They did not want to be forgotten criminals who disappeared into the night. They wanted their names to be remembered, and they used their intelligence to ensure their story remained on the front pages. By feeding the media machine with material, they took control of their own narrative, building a legend that grew larger with every week they remained free. This self-made myth gave them a sense of power during a time when they possessed very little control over their actual destiny. What's fascinating is that Bonnie and Clyde weren't just part of a legend, they helped create it themselves. If you're enjoying these deeper historical stories and want more facts that rarely make it into movies or textbooks, make sure you're subscribed to Historical Lore. Number 14. Hidden Violent Accomplices. The famous duo were part of a larger criminal organization that included Buck Barrow, Blanche Barrow, W.D. Jones, Henry Methvin, and others. The gang constantly changed through arrests, deaths, and betrayals. The public memory often reduces the story to just two people against the world, but they rarely traveled alone. Their operations required a rotating cast of characters to help with driving, scouting, and firepower during their raids. Clyde's older brother, Buck, joined the group after receiving a pardon from prison, bringing his wife, Blanche, along into the dangerous lifestyle. Young associates like W.D. Jones were recruited to serve as mechanics and lookouts, often finding themselves trapped in a world of violence they did not fully understand. The dynamics within this larger group were incredibly volatile. They were not a tight band of loyal brothers. They were terrified individuals living under extreme stress. Arguments broke out constantly over money, directions, and the constant danger of their situation. The presence of extra people meant more mouths to feed, more voices to argue, and more opportunities for someone to make a fatal mistake. The group structure was a fragile thing, constantly shifting as members were wounded in gunfights or captured by the police. This rotating circle of accomplices added to the chaos of their daily lives, ensuring that peace was a luxury they would never experience. Number 13. Brief tragic romance. Although their legend suggests a lifelong romance, Clyde spent much of their relationship in prison. Out of the 4 years between their first meeting and their violent death, they were physically together for less than 2 years. They met in Texas in early 1930, experiencing an immediate connection, but their time together was almost immediately cut short. Clyde was arrested shortly after and sent to jail, leaving Bonnie to wait for him on the outside. During his time behind bars, Bonnie smuggled a gun into the prison to help him escape, but he was quickly recaptured and sent to a much harsher facility. This pattern of separation defined the early years of their relationship. The grand romance was interrupted by long stretches of cold iron bars and distance. Even after Clyde finally gained his release, their time together was lived in short bursts between frantic flights and dangerous shootouts. The image of a long, unbroken journey of love is a total construction of later storytellers. The real couple had to build their relationship in the brief spaces allowed by the law, always aware that the clock was ticking down toward their final separation. The time they actually spent looking into each other's eyes was brief, shadowed by the constant threat of the prison system that kept pulling them apart. Number 12. Furious screaming matches. Recovered letters and family testimony suggest frequent arguments, separations, and attempts to leave one another. The reality was far messier than Hollywood's perfect romance. The constant pressure of running from the police created an environment of extreme stress that tore at their mutual affection. They did not spend their days exchanging gentle words of love. They yelled, accused each other of mistakes, and often threatened to go their separate ways. Bonnie grew lonely for her mother and frequently wept, begging Clyde to risk their lives by driving back to Texas just so she could see her family for a few minutes. Clyde was consumed by paranoia and anger, his mind focused entirely on avoiding capture. This emotional distance created deep cracks in their bond. There were times when Bonnie stayed behind with relatives, trying to imagine a life without Clyde, only to be drawn back by fear or a lack of other options. Their letters reveal a couple that was trapped together by circumstances rather than united in perfect harmony. They stayed together because they knew too much about each other's crimes and because leaving meant facing the world completely alone. The romance was a fragile, thin layer covering a deep well of resentment and fear, a bond that was fraying more and more with every mile they traveled down those dusty roads. Number 11. Rolling National Guard. The image of the successful bank robber during the Great Depression usually features a suitcase stuffed with cash and an expensive hotel suite. The reality for Bonnie and Clyde was completely different. By the early months of 1934, their entire material existence was restricted to the cramped interior of a stolen Ford V8 sedan. Everything they owned in the world, including their weapons, their spare clothes, their few personal treasures, and their meager funds, sat inside that single vehicle. They had become a mobile enterprise of survival, stripped of any connection to a permanent home or a stable life. If they needed to abandon the vehicle due to a police ambush, they were forced to abandon everything they owned along with it. The money they secured from their small robberies was spent almost immediately on basic necessities. They were forced to pay heavily inflated prices to black market dealers and nervous associates for gasoline, ammunition, and medicine. Because they could not walk into ordinary stores without risking immediate recognition and arrest, their purchasing power was drastically reduced. They were regularly taken advantage of by individuals who knew they were desperate and could not complain to the authorities. This constant financial drain meant that America's most famous outlaws lived in a state of perpetual financial anxiety. They were nearly broke during the height of their national fame, surviving from one small robbery to the next just to buy fuel. Their material possessions reflected a life focused entirely on violence and flight. Alongside a few changes of wrinkled, unwashed clothing sat an enormous arsenal of high-powered firearms. They favored military weapons, particularly Browning automatic rifles stolen from National Guard armories, which occupied the bulk of the space in the back seat and trunk. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were stored in heavy canvas bags, creating a dangerous and heavy cargo that weighed down the vehicle. The only item that did not serve a violent purpose was Bonnie's favorite guitar. It sat in the back, its wood scratched and bruised by the constant rubbing against steel gun barrels. This guitar was a fragile reminder of a normal life that was rapidly fading away. The lack of space created constant physical discomfort. Every item had to be carefully arranged so that the weapons were always within arm's reach of Clyde and his passengers. This meant that their clothes and personal items were jammed into the small spaces beneath the seats or used as makeshift pillows during long drives. They lived in a state of chaotic clutter, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the remnants of their daily survival. The wealth that the public imagined them holding was an illusion created by the dramatic headlines of the era. The real couple owned nothing but a rolling collection of stolen property that grew more battered with every passing mile. Number 10. Rotting getaway cars. The vehicle that carried Bonnie and Clyde across the American West was celebrated in the newspapers as a symbol of modern speed and ultimate freedom. To the couple trapped inside, it was a confined space of physical misery. The interior of the stolen Ford V8 smelled of human sweat, spoiled food, old blood, gasoline fumes, dirty clothes, and burnt gunpowder. Because the pressure from law enforcement was so intense, they frequently spent weeks at a time without ever stepping away from the vehicle for more than a few minutes. The car had transformed from a getaway tool into a cramped, filthy survival shelter that they could never leave. The necessity for total secrecy meant that the windows were often kept rolled up, even during the intense heat of the southern summer. This trapped the moisture and the compounding odors inside the small cabin, creating a deeply uncomfortable atmosphere. Garbage accumulated rapidly on the floorboards, including empty tin cans with sharp edges, greasy parchment wrappers, and rotting fruit skins that attracted insects. They lacked the opportunity to dispose of their waste conventionally, so they simply pushed the refuse under the front seats where it decomposed in the dark. The floor mats were permanently saturated with engine oil from their spare parts, and the thick mud tracked in from the roadside ditches where they parked. The physical trauma of their criminal lifestyle left a permanent mark on the interior fabric of the car. When members of the Barrow Gang were wounded during their frequent gunfights with police, they were treated and bandaged in the back seat while the car traveled at high speeds down bumpy dirt tracks. Dark, rusty stains of dried human blood covered the upholstery, serving as a silent visual reminder of their previous narrow escapes. They did not possess the cleaning supplies or the time required to scrub the fabric, so they simply covered the stains with dirty blankets or extra clothing. The air inside the vehicle was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe during long journeys. Living inside the vehicle also took a severe toll on their physical health. The lack of movement caused their muscles to cramp and their joints to stiffen, leaving them in a state of chronic physical pain. They suffered from constant headaches caused by the inhalation of exhaust fumes that leaked through the floorboards of the stolen cars. The Ford V8 was undeniably fast, but it offered little comfort and no escape from the harsh reality of their lives. Every time Clyde turned the key in the ignition, they were reminded that their survival depended entirely on remaining inside this mechanical box. Number 9. Living like animals. The popular myth surrounding the lives of famous Depression-era bandits often includes secret cabins hidden deep in the mountains, complete with hot meals, soft beds, and loyal caretakers. The reality for the Barrow Gang was a brutal existence devoid of any basic human comforts. They spent their nights parked under the dense cover of trees, hidden behind high brush at the edge of isolated pastures or deep within public woods. They could never risk checking into tourist camps, motels, or boarding houses, as doing so would provide a direct trail for local law enforcement. Sleeping inside the sedan required twisting their bodies into unnatural positions across the seats, which resulted in regular exhaustion and back pain. When the summer heat made the car's interior unbearable, they spread rough, dirty blankets directly onto the bare ground outside. This exposed them to mosquitoes, wood ticks, and the damp chill of the night earth. They woke up at the first sign of dawn, their bones aching from the cold, and their minds instantly filled with fear at the sound of a distant farm tractor or a barking dog. They were always on high alert, ready to jump into the vehicle and drive away at a moment's notice. Personal hygiene became impossible during their long periods on the run. They could not use public facilities or laundromats without inviting suspicion, so they were forced to wash themselves in whatever natural water sources they encountered: muddy rivers, stagnant creeks, and freezing mountain streams, rushing through their washing out of fear that a local fisherman or landowner might spot them. They washed their clothes in the same cold water, then hung them out to dry inside the moving car or spread them over the hot engine block. Their skin became rough and sun-damaged, their hair grew matted and dirty, and their limbs were covered in untreated insect bites and painful rashes. This rough way of life rapidly eroded their health, appearance, and personal dignity. They no longer resembled the clean, stylish young people captured in their early photographs. They looked exactly like what they had become: hunted fugitives who were physically deteriorating from a total lack of proper nutrition, rest, and care. The wide open spaces of the American West provided them with hiding places, but it also forced them to live like wild animals, stripped of the most basic comforts of human civilization. Number 8. Bonnie's hidden role. Most people remember Bonnie Parker as a fearless criminal who stood beside Clyde Barrow during every shootout. The historical records paint a remarkably different picture of her actual role within the gang. There is no confirmed ballistics evidence or reliable eyewitness testimony that proves Bonnie ever personally shot or killed a single human being. While she was an active accomplice who willingly participated in the gang's criminal operations, the actual execution of violence was handled by the men. Bonnie's primary responsibilities within the Barrow Gang were focused on logistics, navigation, and maintaining their mobility. She possessed a sharp mind and was responsible for studying maps, planning escape routes through the maze of rural roads, and tracking police movements through newspaper reports. During the chaotic moments of their robberies, her job was typically to remain behind the wheel of the getaway vehicle or sit in the passenger seat with the engine running, ensuring that the gang could make an immediate escape the moment Clyde returned. She also assisted in maintaining their weapons, loading the heavy ammunition magazines for the automatic rifles so that Clyde would always have a fresh supply of firepower during a confrontation. When the gang found themselves trapped in sudden ambushes, Bonnie's first instinct was to seek cover rather than engage in a gunfight. Eyewitness accounts from various shootouts consistently describe a small woman ducking low beneath the dashboard or cowering on the floorboards of the car while Clyde and associates like W.D. Jones traded shots with the police. She was surrounded by extreme violence, but she was a witness and an enabler rather than an active shooter. The image of her as a deadly killer was intentionally amplified by the authorities and prosecutors who wanted to ensure that the public would support using lethal force against her when the time came. Bonnie allowed the public to believe the myth because it matched the tough, rebellious character she created for herself in her poems. She enjoyed the notoriety that came with being viewed as a dangerous woman. But the reality was that she was a passenger in a journey of violence driven by others. She carried the heavy legal guilt of their crimes, she accepted the stolen cash, and she actively protected the killers, but she never pulled the trigger that ended a life. Here's a question for you. If Bonnie never fired a confirmed fatal shot, should history view her differently, or was she just as responsible for everything the gang did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Number 7. Clyde's early darkness. A common romantic theme in the storytelling surrounding Bonnie and Clyde is the idea that Clyde Barrow was a normal, decent young man who was transformed into a desperate criminal by the economic devastation of the Great Depression or by his overwhelming love for Bonnie Parker. This narrative is directly contradicted by his extensive juvenile and adult police records in Dallas, Texas. Long before he ever laid eyes on Bonnie in 1930, Clyde had already committed himself to a life of theft, evasion, and physical confrontation. He was already moving down a dark path long before she joined him. Growing up in the impoverished and neglected neighborhood of West Dallas, Clyde was exposed to criminal activity at a very young age. He dropped out of school early and joined loose networks of local youths who specialized in petty theft, chicken stealing, and car burglary. He displayed an early fascination with machinery and firearms, quickly learning how to hotwire the fast vehicles of the era and navigate the complex alleyways of the city to evade the local patrolmen. His early arrests show a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that began well before the economic crash of 1929. He rejected regular employment, preferring the fast rewards and the excitement of illegal activities. Clyde also possessed a volatile temper and a willingness to use physical force to achieve his goals. He was arrested for regular physical assaults and firearms violations as a teenager, showing that he did not hesitate to threaten others when confronted. His lifestyle had already brought him to the attention of the Dallas Police Department as a hardened habitual offender before he turned 20. He was not a victim of sudden circumstance. He was an active participant in the criminal underworld of his city. When he met Bonnie Parker at a friend's house in January of 1930, he did not hide his criminal background from her. He was already a wanted man with a reputation for danger, which was precisely what attracted her to him. Bonnie did not corrupt an innocent boy. She attached her destiny to a man who had already established a life of crime. Clyde's violent tendencies were already fully formed, and his trajectory toward a major clash with the law was set before Bonnie ever agreed to step into his car. Number 6. Tortured by steel. If Clyde Barrow was a small-time car thief and petty burglar before his confinement, his experience inside the Texas prison system transformed him into a cold, calculating enemy of society. In 1930, he was sentenced to a long term at the notorious Eastham Prison Farm, a facility known throughout the American South for its brutal discipline, horrific living conditions, and systemic violence. The time he spent behind those wires broke his remaining respect for human authority and replaced it with a permanent desire for revenge. The conditions at Eastham were designed to break the spirit of the inmates through grueling physical labor under the intense Texas sun. Prisoners were marched into the fields at dawn and forced to work under the gaze of mounted guards who carried whips and high-powered rifles. Minor infractions of the prison rules resulted in immediate physical beatings or confinement in isolated cells devoid of light and air. During his sentence, Clyde was also subjected to repeated physical abuse by a larger, hardened inmate who targeted him due to his small physical stature. This trauma deeply altered Clyde's psychological state, instilling a deep paranoia and a burning rage against both his abusers and the system that allowed the abuse to happen. The young man who walked out of Eastham in 1932 on a parole release was unrecognizable to his family. The experience had removed his hesitation regarding the use of lethal force. He emerged from the prison farm with a fierce determination never to be taken alive by law enforcement again. He viewed every police officer, sheriff, and state trooper not as a representative of the law, but as a direct threat who wanted to return him to the horrors of Eastham. This psychological shift explains the sudden escalation of violence that characterized the Barrow gang's subsequent run. Clyde was no longer interested in simple evasion. He was prepared to launch immediate deadly attacks against any authority figure who attempted to block his path. The casual cruelty and extreme violence he witnessed and endured behind the bars of the prison farm became the defining features of his remaining years on Earth, turning a petty criminal into a national threat. Number 5. Severed for escape. The desperation that Clyde Barrow experienced during his confinement at the Eastham prison farm reached a dramatic peak in the early months of 1932. The grueling, non-stop physical labor in the agricultural fields had broken his body, and he realized that he could not survive the remaining years of his sentence under such harsh conditions. Desperate for any escape from the daily torture of the work details, Clyde decided to take a drastic and permanent measure to alter his own physical body. He arranged for another inmate to assist him in a deliberate act of self-mutilation. Using a heavy, sharp tool, Clyde had 2 of the toes severed from his left foot. The wound caused massive blood loss and immediate agony, requiring him to be transferred to the prison infirmary for emergency medical treatment. He believed that the permanent loss of his toes would render him incapable of standing for long hours in the fields, forcing the prison authorities to assign him to a lighter indoor work detail. It was a calculated sacrifice of his own flesh made to escape the daily brutality of the guards. The bitter irony of his action emerged just a few days after the mutilation took place. Unbeknownst to Clyde, his mother had been working tirelessly on the outside to secure his release from prison. Just a week after he severed his toes, his family successfully obtained a conditional parole from the Texas governor, allowing him to walk out of the prison gates as a free man. If he had waited just a few more days, he would have left the facility with his body completely intact. Instead, he gained his freedom at the cost of a permanent physical disability. The self-inflicted injury left Clyde with a severe permanent limp that affected his movement for the rest of his life. He could no longer run effectively or walk without experiencing a degree of physical discomfort. To compensate for the imbalance caused by his missing toes, he had to drive his vehicles with a modified stance, using his right foot for almost all critical pedal operations. The limp became a distinct identifying characteristic that local sheriffs looked for when questioning witnesses. This injury remained a permanent physical reminder of the desperation that drove him, a scar from his time in hell that followed him all the way to his final day on the road. Number 4. Stealing from the penniless. The enduring myth of the outlaw often presents these individuals as modern versions of Robin Hood, characters who targeted the large financial institutions that were foreclosing on family farms and destroying the lives of ordinary citizens. The public often took comfort in the idea that Bonnie and Clyde were extracting wealth from the corrupt banking system to help the needy. The actual historical records of their robberies reveal a completely different set of targets. The Barrow gang rarely struck large banks. Instead, they focused their criminal energy on the most vulnerable small businesses in the rural South. Their typical targets included isolated gas stations, small mom-and-pop grocery stores, roadside diners, and tiny country banks that held very little cash. They often robbed individual citizens, small-town mechanics, and even funeral home directors, taking whatever meager funds were available in the cash drawers. The amounts they secured from these raids were often incredibly small, sometimes totaling less than $10 from a single robbery. The people they targeted were ordinary, hard-working citizens who were struggling to survive the economic collapse just as much as anyone else. A robbery by the Barrow gang could mean the immediate financial ruin of an entire family business. The reason for this choice of targets was entirely practical. Clyde Barrow was terrified of the sophisticated security measures found in large city banks such as silent alarms, armed guards, and heavy steel vaults. He knew that attempting a large-scale robbery in a major city would result in an immediate confrontation with an organized police force. He preferred targets where the owners were unarmed, elderly, or entirely unprotected, allowing him to secure quick cash with minimal risk. This meant that the burden of their crimes fell squarely on the shoulders of the working poor. They did not redistribute the wealth they stole to the communities they passed through. Every dollar taken from a small-town grocery store was used exclusively to fund their own survival, leaving a trail of broke and traumatized families behind them. The romantic image of the outlaws fighting for the common man disappears when faced with the list of their victims. They were small-time thieves who targeted the weak and the isolated, taking the hard-earned money of people who had very little left to lose. We're down to the final 3 facts now. And the story is about to get much darker. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. We release in-depth historical documentaries every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Number 3. Slaughtering the innocent. The cost of the Barrow Gang's multi-year run across the American countryside is measured in human lives. They are officially linked to the killings of at least 13 individuals, a number that includes both law enforcement officers and ordinary civilians. The popular narrative often treats these killings as dramatic segments of an exciting adventure story. But the real victims were ordinary people who left behind grieving families and communities. The majority of the law enforcement officers killed by Clyde and his associates were poorly paid small-town sheriffs, rural deputies, and highway patrolmen who were simply doing their jobs to support their children. These officers did not possess modern protective gear, advanced communication systems, or high-powered automatic weapons. They often encountered the Barrow Gang by complete accident during routine traffic stops or while investigating suspicious vehicles parked on country lanes. When they approached the car, they were met with immediate overwhelming firepower from Clyde's stolen military rifles. Officers like Deputy Eugene Moore and Patrolman H.D. Murphy were shot down without warning, leaving behind wives and young children who were thrust into immediate financial poverty during the darkest years of the Great Depression. The families of these fallen men received no significant state compensation, leaving them to navigate their grief alongside severe financial ruin. The violence was not reserved exclusively for those who wore a badge. The gang displayed a complete disregard for the lives of anyone who attempted to slow down their escape or protect their property. They shot witnesses who happened to see them changing license plates in the woods and fired into crowds of bystanders when fleeing the scene of a robbery. The men who died at their hands were not corrupt agents of a broken system. They were fathers, brothers, and sons who were trying to earn a modest living in a difficult world. The romantic legend built around Bonnie and Clyde requires ignoring the empty chairs at the dinner tables of 13 American homes. The real story is one of sudden, senseless violence that targeted working-class individuals who had the misfortune of crossing paths with a paranoid, heavily armed driver. The suffering inflicted by the gang extended far beyond the immediate targets of their bullets, leaving a legacy of pain that lasted for generations in the small towns of the West. Number 2. Left for dead. While the killing of law enforcement officers created national headlines and turned the federal government against the Barrow Gang, some of the darkest episodes of their run involved the deaths of completely innocent civilians. These individuals had no connection to the justice system and were merely going about their daily routines when the gang's ruthlessness suddenly confronted them. One of the most tragic examples of this complete disregard for human life occurred during a vehicle robbery in Hillsborough, Texas. The gang targeted a local store owner named Doyle Johnson, a hardworking family man who was attempting to protect his property from being stolen. When Johnson realized that his vehicle was being taken from outside his home, he attempted to intervene. Without a second thought, members of the gang opened fire on the unarmed man, killing him in front of his neighbors. His death left his family without a provider during a time when employment was nearly impossible to find. This was not an isolated incident of collateral damage. It was part of a consistent pattern of behavior where human life was treated as entirely disposable if it interfered with their mobility. Another innocent civilian victim was a store clerk who was shot during a routine robbery because he did not move quickly enough to empty the cash register. The gang did not hesitate to use lethal force to secure a few dollars, showing that their fear of capture had completely erased their sense of basic human empathy. They operated under a cloud of constant panic which made them unpredictable and incredibly dangerous to anyone they encountered on the road. The public began to realize that the romantic figures described in the newspapers were actually a threat to every ordinary citizen in the country. The stories of these civilian casualties were often pushed to the back pages of the newspapers to make room for the more dramatic accounts of shootouts with the Texas Rangers. For the victims' families, there was no romance or adventure in the story of Bonnie and Clyde. There was only the sudden loss of a loved one and the long, difficult struggle to survive in the aftermath of a senseless crime. The historical reality of the Barrow Gang is defined by these moments of unprovoked violence against the very people they claimed to represent. Number 1. 130 bullet holes. The final chapter of the Bonnie and Clyde story took place on a lonely, sun-baked road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana on May 23, 1934. After months of intense coordination between federal agents, Texas authorities, and local sheriffs, the gang was finally betrayed by the family of one of their own associates, Henry Methvin. The long-lived myth of a glorious dramatic shootout where the lovers died holding hands in a brave stance against the law is completely destroyed by the horrific reality of the ambush that ended their lives. It was an execution carried out with military precision and overwhelming force. A posse of 6 heavily armed law enforcement officers led by the legendary Texas Ranger Frank Hamer lay in wait behind the thick brush along the highway. They knew that Clyde was driving a stolen Ford the 5th 8 down that specific stretch of road, and they had resolved not to give the outlaws any opportunity to use their powerful automatic rifles.